I now give the floor to His Excellency Sergey Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the statements at the general debate prove that international relations are going through quite a complicated and controversial period of history. Today, we're all witnessing a collision of two opposing trends. On the one hand, we see the strengthening of polycentric principles of the world order, the steady development of new centers of economic growth, the aspiration of peoples to preserve sovereignty and choose development models that are consistent with their national, cultural, and religious identities. On the other hand, we see the desire of several Western states to retain their self-proclaimed status as world leaders and to slow down the irreversible objective process of establishing multipolarity. To that end, these powers do not hesitate to use any methods, including political blackmail, economic pressure, and brute force. These illicit acts devalue the international law which underpins the post-war world order. We hear loud statements that not only call into question the legal validity of international treaties, but also declare the priority of self-serving unilateral approaches over the decisions taken in the framework of the United Nations. We are observing an onslaught of belligerent revisionism against the modern system of international law. Attacks have been launched against the basic principles of the Middle East peace process, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program, the commitments within the World Trade Organization framework, the Multilateral Climate Agreement, and many more. At the same time, our Western colleagues are persistently trying to substitute some sort of rules-based order for the supremacy of law in world affairs. These rules themselves get invented depending on political expediency and are an illustration of double standards. Baseless accusations of interference into internal affairs of certain countries are being made at the same time as overt endeavors to undermine and topple democratically elected governments. Attempts are being made to draw certain countries into military alliances that are tailor-made to further their specific agendas against the will of the peoples, while other states are threatened with punishment for their free choice of partners and allies. It is indicative that aggressive attacks on international institutions are accompanied by attempts to privatize their secretarial structures to grant them the rights of intergovernmental bodies in the hope of manipulating them later. The shrinking space for constructive international cooperation, escalating confrontation, growing overall unpredictability, a substantially increased risk of spontaneous conflicts, all this affects the work of the World Organization. The international community has to pay a high price for the parochial, self-serving ambitions of a small group of countries. The collective mechanisms of response to common security challenges have stalled. Diplomacy and the culture of negotiations and compromise have been increasingly replaced by dictates and unilateral extraterritorial restrictions put in effect without the consent of the UN Security Council. Such measures, applied already to dozens of countries, are not only illicit but are also ineffective, as exemplified in particular by more than half a century-long U.S. blockade of Cuba, which has been condemned by the entire international community. Yet once again, lessons are not drawn from history. The number of those wishing to hand down verdicts without any charges or trial is not getting any smaller. Today, assumptions in the spirit of the notorious highly likely are sufficient for some of our Western colleagues to level accusations against anyone. We've already been through this. We remember very well how often spurious pretexts were used to justify interventions and unleash wars, as was the case in Yugoslavia in 1999, Iraq 2003, and Libya 2011. The same methods are being applied today to Syria, against whose territory missile strikes were launched under a totally trumped-up pretext on April 14th of this year, just hours before international inspectors were expected to arrive at the site of the staged incident. We warn that any further provocations by terrorists and their patrons with the use of chemical weapons are unacceptable. The conflict in Syria is already 7 years old. The failed attempt to effect regime change, orchestrated from outside relying on extremists, nearly resulted in the disintegration of the country and the emergence of a terrorist caliphate in its stead. The energetic actions by Russia in response to the request of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic and supported by the diplomatic efforts in the framework of the Astana process helped to prevent this devastating scenario. The Syrian National Dialogue Congress, initiated by Russia, Iran, Turkey this January, created conditions for a political settlement on the basis of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. This is precisely the basis for the Inter-Syrian Constitutional Committee that is currently being established in Geneva. Its agenda includes the restoration of destroyed infrastructure to facilitate the return of millions of refugees to their homes. Assistance in addressing these tasks in the interests of all Syrians without any double standards must become the priority of international efforts and the activities of UN agencies. With all the complexity of the situation in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, we must not lose sight of the long-standing Palestinian problem. A just and equitable solution to that situation is crucial for improving the situation across the entire Middle East. I would like to warn against any unilateral approaches and attempts to monopolize this peace process. Today as never before, the international community should consolidate its efforts with the aim of restarting talks on the basis of UN resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. Russia will continue to do its utmost to facilitate this process, including within the Quartet on the Middle East and in cooperation with the League of Arab States and Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Mutually acceptable agreements must ensure the peaceful and secure coexistence of the two states, Israel and Palestine. Here, at the United Nations, created on the basis of the lessons learned from World War II, we all must think about the future, in which the repetition of the mistakes of the past should have no place. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the notorious Munich Agreement that crowned the criminal appeasement policy toward the Third Reich, which is a sad example of the catastrophic consequences that can result from national egoism, disregard for international law, and attempts to solve problems at the expense of others. Regrettably, today in a number of countries, we witness that not just the vaccine against the Nazi plague has weakened, but also a campaign of rewriting history and whitewashing war criminals and their associates is on the rise. We regard as an outrage the campaigns waged in a number of countries to demolish the monuments to the liberators of Europe. We call upon you to support the UN draft resolution on the inadmissibility of glorification of the Nazis. The growth of radical nationalism and neo-fascism in Ukraine, where criminals who fought under SS banners have been declared heroes, is one of the main factors of the protracted intra-Ukrainian conflict. The only way to settle this conflict is to ensure a comprehensive and consistent implementation of the Minsk package of measures approved unanimously by the UN Security Council. We support the activities of the OSCE mission in Ukraine and are ready to provide its observers with a UN security detail. Yet instead of implementing the Minsk agreements and instead of a dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk, Kyiv keeps harboring illusions that it might be able to bring occupying forces to Donbass with the support of the West, and is increasingly using threats to resort to military options. Those who sponsor the present Kyiv authorities must bring their charges to their senses and make them lift the blockade of Donbass and stop the discrimination of ethnic minorities across the Ukraine. Now, in Kosovo, the international military presence authorized by the UN Security Council is being transformed into a U.S. military base. The Kosovo armed forces are being created. The agreements between Belgrade and Pristina brokered by the EU are not being implemented. Russia calls on the parties to engage in dialogue in accordance with the principles of Security Council Resolution 1244 and will support a decision that will be acceptable for Serbia. On the whole, we urge that the Balkans not be transformed into an arena for confrontation once again or declared someone's domain, that the peoples of the Balkans countries must not be compelled to face a false choice, and the emergence of new dividing lines must be prevented. Molding of an architecture of equal and indivisible security is also required in other parts of the world, including the Asia-Pacific region. We welcome positive developments around the Korean Peninsula that follow the logic of the Russian-Chinese roadmap. It is important to encourage this process on the basis of further steps of the parties towards each other and by promoting practical implementation of the important arrangements between Pyongyang and Seoul through the UN Security Council. We will continue to work towards the launch as soon as possible of the multilateral process aimed at establishing a robust mechanism for peace and security in Northeast Asia. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is part of the tasks facing the international community in the key area of international security. The non-proliferation of WMDs. Regrettably, serious impediments continue to accumulate on this track. The U.S. Unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA in violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. This, despite the fact that Iran is fully complying with its obligation, has come on top of the lack of progress in the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the establishment of weapons WMD free zone in the Middle East. We will do everything possible to preserve the deal that was approved by the UN Security Council. Now, negative trends are accumulating in the OPCW activities, where the West is trying to transform the Technical Secretariat into an instrument for punishing undesirable governments, which risks compromising the independent professional status of this institution, the universality of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the exclusive prerogatives of the UN Security Council. These and other problems in the sphere of non-proliferation were discussed in detail at the UN Security Council meeting on September 26th. That was quite timely convened by the U.S. presidency. We strongly believe that any problems or concerns that arise in international relations must be addressed through a substantive dialogue. If there are any bones of contention against anyone, we should come around a negotiating table, have a talk, present facts, heed counter-arguments of their partners, and seek a balance of interests. Over the last couple of years, the debate on cyberspace abuse has exacerbated. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that it has already been 20 years since Russia initiated the discussion of the issues of international information security at the UN. Against the background of the recent developments, it is becoming even more relevant to elaborate under UN auspices a set of global norms of responsible behavior of states in the information space, including the principles of non-use of force, non-interference in internal affairs, and respect for state sovereignty. We intend to introduce a draft of such a resolution in the UN General Assembly First Committee. We also believe that it's important to start work on a convention on cybercrime and envisage to hold relevant discussions in Third Committee. The search for generally acceptable understandings and mutual considerations of interest is required as never before in world trade and economic relations that today are subject to unprecedented politicization. The values of free trade have become hostages to trade wars and other forms of unfair competition. Russia has consistently promoted the philosophy of indivisibility of economic development that has been enshrined in the initiative of the Greater Eurasian Partnership put forward by President Vladimir Putin. This is a large-scale project which is open to all Asian and European states, regardless of their membership in various integration associations. The consistent implementation of this project could contribute to the development of a broad space for extensive economic cooperation in Eurasia. And in the long run, it could become the foundation for a renewed architecture of continental security, corresponding to the realities of the 21st century. Russia continues to do its utmost to build a world on the basis of law, truth, and justice. We're not alone in this aspiration. Our allies and partners in the CSTO, EAEC, CIS, BRICS, SCO, and the overwhelming majority of other countries, together with us, advocate the democratization of international life in all its manifestations and in the interests of all the states without exception. The West also has to heed their increasingly resonating voice, which is becoming increasingly apparent in the activities of the G20. In today's turbulent circumstances, the growing relevance of the United Nations, the only existing forum to overcome differences and coordinate activities of the international community, is an objective reality. Collective work in the interest of coordinating generally acceptable solutions as a top priority was built from the very start into the foundations of the UN. We must not fail to live up to the high goals and principles of the UN Charter and the obligations of the Founding Fathers to the next generation. We should recall the art of negotiation in order to be worthy of their legacy. Numerous problems of the modern time can be resolved only on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Dictates and coercion, so typical of the colonial era, are to be sent once and for all to be stored in the archive, or even better, left on the ashes heap of history. Great statesmen of the past have given us quite a lot of a few words of guidance that have become aphorisms. Let me quote just one, and it belongs to President Harry Truman. Great nations lead by the force of example rather than domination. End of quote. I hope that the culture of mutually respectable dialogue will finally prevail. Russia will do its utmost to promote this goal. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation for his statement.